Hey, Mark, welcome to the Beyond Jaws podcast. Are you ready to talk about sharks?
Yes, I am.
I'm really excited today with today's guest. We have Marc Dando, who's a good friend, a terrific guy, and he does all the illustrations for the books, the Sharks of the World books, and several other books that we'll talk about today that he's working on. Mark's coming to us from England today, and he did his BSc and honors in zoology at Nottingham University. And after finishing his degree in zoology, he moved on to actually becoming a graphic designer, which eventually led to his becoming a wildlife illustrator. And we'll listen to Mark today. We'll tell about his story on how he got started. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody.
How did you get interested in sharks, wildlife in general, and illustrating?
I suppose it all started when I was very young because I've always been interested in natural history. I remember when Jaws first came out and just staring into the water. I was a bit scared, everybody got a bit scared about those times, freaked out a little. But I just got interested in natural history. I was always drawing animals. I just didn't stop. I just doodled into anything I possibly could. School teachers used to tell me off for drawing all these things. And I just eventually migrated, because of choice often, to actually use my art in natural history. I got a degree in zoology, which is of great help. It's really good to have that sort of scientific background when you're a scientific illustrator, because you have to understand and talk to researchers, and you have to understand what they're trying to explain to you. But it wasn't to be that I could go straight out from having a degree in zoology. So my second love was art. And I was always designing things for various bits and pieces. I did a lot at university. The Rag Mag, the Rag Week, we used to always have a cartoon character. I ended up by drawing all those. And so I just eventually started to work in graphic design. I had friends of mine who were graphic designers. I started work, basically doing pub menus and things like that and drawing people's houses. And I was fortunate enough to be picked up doing some work for a large printer, local printer. And I was brought on board with this person called Christopher Helm. And if anyone's into ornithological books, Christopher Helm is well known. And I was so fortunate. And he offered that if I wanted to work on some of his publications, which I jumped at, I was just highly delighted. And I just started to work on putting natural history books together for him, which are mainly to do with birds. But then the choice was, it came across, it was absolutely brilliant at the right time to work on a book called Sea Life. And then it all just went from there. I met Sarah Fowler, and then it just happened from that point onwards.
Did you have any particular, because you did obviously your degree in zoology, did you have any particular training you did when you started getting into graphic design to like how to illustrate, like, the birds or sharks, whatever?
I got a A-level in art, so we did a lot of practicing drawing, other bits like that. I did 3 months at a graphic studio doing graphic art, but I just wanted to get out there and start drawing, because I've always been drawing. It's one of those things that it is good to go to art school, but if you have an ability, it just tends to get out there. You don't always have to have a piece of paper. You just say, look, this is what I can do. And then people go, hey, do you want to work for me? Do you want this done? And I think that's the way the arts side went. And I just carried on working from there. But as I said, it was Sea Life was the one that gave me the great break, the one I really wanted. And I ended up by actually writing a whole chapter on invertebrates, marine invertebrates. And it illustrated the majority of the plates except for the bird books. And then, as I said, it was then I met Kevin Morgan, who actually introduced me to do the book, and it was his idea. But we were just we went up to London and we went to the Natural History Museum because they had a talk there. And there I met Sarah Fowler, who was starting out on the road to create the Shark Trust. And I just got started to talk to her. I knew by that time HarperCollins, Miles Archibald, and we first of all pitched an idea, Kevin and I, to do a book on whales and dolphins. And Miles said, well, yeah, there's quite a few books like that, but if you could do a book on sharks, then yeah, I'll be up for it. So I went scampering back to Sarah and going, hey, would you like to work on a book on sharks? She said, yeah, that'd be really good, but we need somebody taxonomical person. And here comes Dave's mentor is Leonard Campagno, and I was introduced to Leonard by Sarah. And Leonard at that time was avid to do that, and that's how the first version, which is the Collins Guide of Sharks of the World, actually came about. It was just those meetings, and it took 3.5, 4 years of illustrating, putting a book together, that we ended up with the Collins Guide. Yeah, so yeah, it does take time. That's what most people don't realise, is how long it takes to do these illustrations, to get them right, to do the research.
How many illustrations, like in your Sea Life book and even the Shark book, like how many illustrations did you do for each of those books off the top?
Off the top of my head, well, I know with the Sea Life book, I did a lot of pen and ink work, and I think there's something like 600 or 700 pen and ink drawings in that. And then there's the colour plates themselves, and that must cover about 300 or 400 species in there. And we did a lot of work that we wanted to do, especially with the marine invertebrates, would actually put them in context. And that's what takes the biggest amount of time. It's not always the animals. It's when you try and do the habitat, you speak to most illustrators when they do things like that. Habitats take ages, so that took a fair amount of time. But Sharks of the World, that was 3.5 years, and there were in total there was 64 plates, but there was either side of the pages, so 128 in total plates, and had about 5 or 6 species each plate. So that was in the time I used watercolor.
Yeah. Now the other part too is like when you talk about doing the illustrations, you also are very involved in the layout of all these books as well. So it's not just the actual illustration, but it's actually doing the layout, how the book's actually going to look. Now, was that something you just picked out from your graphic design work earlier in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it meshed really well because when you do graphic design, you think about layout, you think how things will actually look, think how things are interesting. But I think when you've got scientific information, natural history, you've got to think about the flow of the thing. You've got to make it really pretty looking for people to get engaged. But once it's there, you've got to impart that information as clearly as possible, and to make it interesting. And I think that's the skill of most books. If you can't see what they've done, then they've done a good job. It's like the same way when they say a good referee is one you never see in the match. It's one of those ones. If a book is properly designed, then you can't see how it was put together. It just works. It just fits. And I think a lot of the time when you look at books, there's a lot of time spent in design, and making sure it all fits. And you always set the amount of pages as well. So it's not like you've got a never-ending thing. You can have as many pages as you wish. These things have got to be printed. They've got to be affordable, and you've got to take that all on board as you create a book.
When you start out with a book, like working with an author or something, in some of your earlier books, and like you work with the obviously there's different people involved. You got the publisher to work with, you've got the authors to work with, and some of the other possibly editors and work. Can you talk a little bit about some of that whole process? The reason it's interesting is that I don't think people realize when they're doing a book just how much goes in behind. They see the finished product and they think, well, you do a few illustrations, you write some text, and the book's right there. And there's actually quite a bit goes in behind it. Yeah,
I mean, when a book normally starts out, depending on what side of the fence you're on with a book, now we're also publishers. We work for Princeton University Press, but there's always a book proposal. So you put in a book proposal, so you have a rough idea of what the book is actually going to do, what it's on about. Once you get past that, then you get the designers involved, because you've got to work out how the book is going to look, what size the book is, because there are standard sizes that are most affordable for printing, because paper comes in certain sizes. It's all changed now, because in the early days when I first started, everything was made up on a big layout board. You had film where you had to lay out the actual work, put the typesetting down, do overlays, and it was a lot more complex. And then when the print was done, it was metal plates. So basically you tended to have longer print runs, because basically the cost of making up the metal plates and people laying it out. Nowadays, with all the computerization, literally there are plates, but they don't last forever. They're not just kept there. So printers now tend to have smaller runs. And more complex artwork, more color in it, because the old days you couldn't have loads of color.
And it sounded like you were kind of fortunate, because when you actually put in a book proposal, it's not as easy as you think it is. And I've always found, especially early on, that trying to get a book approved by a publisher is probably about half the hurdle of actually getting the book done. I could say this, from my experience, I know my first book I did with actually Leonard Capano on the sharks and rays of Southern Africa. And it took us probably a year and a half to get a publisher lined up for that one. And so when you did your first Sea Life book, you remember how it sounded like you didn't have as much of a challenge with the publisher, or how that goes, especially your first book?
Well, the Sea Life book actually happened because Kevin Morgan, who proposed the book, it was already set up to actually run, but he just needed more people on board. So that's how I got involved, and a friend of mine, Mike Birchett, we actually started working on that. And then another guy comes along. Often you get these books which are really multi-authorship, just happens, more people come in because more expertise is necessary. And then Geoffrey Waller became, edited the whole book. But I think that's not the normal process. And as you said, the normal process is proposals go out. We have proposals all the time at Wild Nature Press, for people come in and you have to vet the thing. And nowadays it's a lot more vetting to do, because you can go online and see what other books those people have done. You can see what other books are going to compete against it. And as we go on, the more and more books are produced. So it becomes even more something to consider. Why does this book have to be here? What's so special about that book that it needs to be published? And as you said, it is difficult. Lots of people have loads of proposals to put it in. And I think also with nature titles, it's not the biggest seller of books. Cookery books outsell and things like that. So when publishers have to look at books like that, they will have to consider that. It has to be a really good book for them to want to publish it. So that's, as an author, that's your first hurdle. But once you get to that point, you're then working with designers. It depends how it fits. Some people just put the whole text out, and then the designers work on that, work on the layout. But it depends on how the publisher works. I mean, there isn't a set golden rule how it actually works. But we work, like Dave, we work closely with you. With the book, and it's a joint effort, and at the end of the day, it works because we're all working together, and you end up with a far better thing than probably individually we could actually think about, having a book. It just works because we've all put our own little bit of magic in for that title.
Right. Well, usually it takes you have to get that concise idea across to the publisher, and you have to have something that sort of catches their eye, that they're going to, why is this going to be yet? It's like everybody wanted to be a wildlife photographer. Everybody at some point in this field has that dream about being the wildlife photographer. But there's only just a handful of people that are like a Chris Fallows who we had on the show, or any number of other well-known wildlife photographers. But there's just a handful of them. But everybody wants to do that. And you just have to have some sort of niche there to fill, or why is yours going to be different to get it across to the publisher? So when you talk about, like, you worked skip backing up a little bit before you got onto your books, how long did you work in the graphic design field before you actually had an opportunity to work on a book, Mark?
Probably, I'm trying to think now, 5-6 years at least, something like that. So when I came out from university, it was sort of it was about 5 or 6 years that I got my chance to do that. But I was always sort of doing natural history work for various people. It wasn't like, hey, one moment I'm a graphic designer and I'm doing things like shampoo labels or something like that, and then, hey, I've suddenly gone into natural history. There was always, leading up to it, I always wanted to sort of meld the two sides to that I had with the natural history, love of natural history, and my zoology degree, and also the art. So, you sort of push that way without realizing.
When did you know that was going to be that could be a career? You've always had that art passion. You've always had that zoology passion. But, growing up, I don't think I would have thought that you could be an illustrator. Not that I had any kind of art talent at all, but
I'm sure you know.
I didn't know that was a no. Gosh, no. I draw a mean stick figure, but that's about it.
Yeah,
that's good enough for me.
It's. I didn't realize it's a full out career. I mean, it makes sense because of the time it takes, and obviously you want to be accurate and things. But when did you realize that was a full? Had you met somebody who did this as a living, or did you know of people who did this as a living? When did you realize that this is something that could be attainable?
I sort of knew quite a few illustrators, especially bird illustrators, because working on bird books for Christopher Helm with those titles that then became part of ANC Black and then became part of Bloomsbury, of all people. I knew loads of bird illustrators, so they submitted work. I talked to a lot of them, and in fact, you sort of say, oh, there's this job going here or that job going there, but I think after Sea Life, I was still trying to find more work that there was out there, and I was put in contact via another bird artist. Well, I'm not a bird artist, but a bird artist called Dave Nerney. He said, "Oh, I've been approached by these publishers to do this work, and I don't work on digital work, and they want some digital work done." And I contacted them, and then that's how I really started doing all the digital work that I do now, was because, I've always been, because I've not been absolutely formally trained as an illustrator, I always have used different mediums all the time. So I do gouache, I do watercolor, I do pen and ink, I do pencil and oil paintings. And so when this came along to do digital, I thought, I use computers all the time, let's have a go. And it just blossomed out. That's how I ended up with the new style of work that I now do, which is used in the field guides a lot. And that was the next break on from there, because then that was really looking to the bigger book of Sharks of the World to do that style and all the field guides and Ghost Sharks, which is what we're going to go on to next.
For people who are interested in this type of career, is it mostly you have your own business and you make connections, just like you made with Christopher Helm and just like you made with Sarah? You start to get introduced to people as you work. It's almost like a referral kind of business. Is that sort of how you set up your business? Sort of here's my business. I do illustrate, like wildlife illustration. This is what the services that I offer and so forth. And then it's just connections through other people and so forth. Is that how it works?
I think that really works now, especially because, with all things like Facebook and whatever, you can have your own Facebook page, Instagram, you can put your work out there. I think a lot of people do set themselves out and they do, offer work for small little organizations so they can start to showcase their work. And I think that's the way the majority of the things happen now. In the early days, It was like that, but it was a little bit more difficult. You can post it everywhere now. You can get your artwork out there all the time. The trouble with that also is you're competing with loads of people around the world. There wasn't such a massive competition when I was there. There was probably people out there, but they didn't have the opportunity to get all their work out there. So in one way it's easier, and in another way it's a lot more difficult. There's a lot of people that ask me about, how would you get into that? I do a scientific illustration course, just a quick one, which is actually going to happen at the end of this month at the MBA, just to give tasters for some people, or some people who just want to hone a skill down. But you just have to keep on drawing, illustrating, just put it out there. That's how I learn. That's how everybody learns. It's literally every day while I'm working on a piece, I just learn something else. How to do something. It's an ongoing learning curve to do that work.
When you started out, Mark, were you you were doing when you did your first couple books? Were you working like a day job, and the books were kind of you worked on the sides, like evenings, weekends, on the sides?
At that time, there was a lot more graphic design, and then I did the work on the side. It was just like trying to chop your day up. But as things sort of got closer to when the book had to be out, you sort of spent more of your time working on the illustration rather than the day job. But lucky enough, my day job has always been sort of graphic design, so the two worked quite easily hand in hand. But I think it's one of those ones that I would say to people, if they are interested, if they have a day job, the time to really explore the art, as it were, is to do it when you have a day job, because you have nothing to risk. You can literally try everything. You can put it out there, and the other thing about making a career out of scientific illustration is you've got to make money, because if that's the main income, you just can't sort of, spend too long working on stuff. Every single piece of work, I always think I can possibly do a little bit more, but the publisher's causing for the work, or somebody else wants it all done, and and you think, this is taking a lot of time. I was just watching this one piece program where this woman said that her art is just absolutely accurate, but she spent like 400 hours on this one piece, and it's like, if you want to earn some money out of that, nobody's going to pay that sort of money for that one piece of artwork. And I think that's the thing, is the skill is doing enough that it gets all that information in there, but everybody's happy. The publisher's got it on time. You're making enough money to keep the wolf from the door, and it looks good enough. And I think that's the thing, is that if that's a skill to do that, especially scientific illustration, because it's got to be accurate. It's got to have that detail. You've got to do that sort of research to get it right. If you're Quentin Blake or something like that, and you could just do the cartoons and you are an illustrator, it just makes it a lot easier, because you can rattle these off a lot easier than sort of doing a picture of a shark with all the details that there has to be in there and make sure it's all correct, than a cartoon of something. So it's a lot harder to get it right.
As you went along, you started building up your career. At what point did you? Because I know you started you and Julie. And I should mention, everybody, Julie Dando, Mark's wife, she's actually really the brains behind the operation, all these books here that Mark and I are doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
She's keeps us in line and make sure we're doing we're staying on the timeline and everything, which is another part of the book process you don't always see behind the scenes.
That's the hardest part.
That is the hardest part. Gosh, that's the unenviable part. But at what point did you build up your career enough that you and Julie decided to jump off and start the Wild Nature Press?
I think it got to a point that basically one thing that actually drove us was we were suddenly realizing with what was happening with natural history publication that it wasn't really looking, to do the sort of books we're doing now with marine natural history. It was, it just wasn't going that way. The detailed work that we put in, it's, again, it goes back to the money with publishers. They've got to make a profit. They've got to turn things around, and those things are very expensive to do. And when you're engaging all these artists that you would have to put together put together these things, it does. You start to look at the bottom line, whether these are actually affordable. So we were realizing that there was going to be a gap occurring for these high-end natural history books. And we knew enough by that time. We'd been in the business for many, many years, that we just felt it was right. We were still working for other publishers as well. So it was our evening job, as it were, when we first started creating that. We were working for mainly Bloomsbury then. And we just were doing that on the side until it got to a point where that was a little bit too much to do to try and balance the two. We still work for other publishers as well. I still do work for other people, other organizations. I do a lot of work for NGOs now. But it was just, it was a risk. We did dive at the deep end. And it was a lot of hours. It was a long hours, we were doing 7 days a week, really late nights, constantly for years on end to get to that point. And then we were very, very lucky. We knew Robert Kirk from Princeton University Press, and he was so impressed with the books that he said, "Hey, would you like to join us?" Which we bit his hands off because, Princeton University Press, you can't get much bigger than that. And, that's it, and that's how we've ended that. It makes it a lot easier, to do these books with that backing.
I can attest, because when I came on board when we did the 2013 edition of the Sharks of the World, when I got involved, and at that point, Mark and Julie with Wild Nature Press were doing our own distribution pretty much, and that was I don't want to say a fiasco, but it was an interesting experience trying to do it yourself. And again, if you're starting out trying to write a book or publish a book, it helps to have a good publisher like Princeton University Press behind you, because the distribution chain can be quite challenging, let's say, to be polite about it.
So how is it challenging, Dave? I want to kind of dive into that a little bit, because there are people who probably want to be authors who are listening to this. What's involved?
Mark, you want to go first?
What, as an author or as a publisher? The distribution side.
As a publisher.
As a publisher, the distribution side is the biggest problem. And right now it's even worse, because basically distribution costs have just gone up 40% in a year. It's just phenomenal. So, and remember, someone's got to swallow that. And because all pockets are tight, people aren't going to want to sort of suddenly have a 40% rise in the price of the books. So things have to be, cleverly worked out. But the distribution, you've got to, once it's printed, it's normally done not in the country where it's normally warehoused. So you've got to get it there. It's got to be distributed to the warehouse. Once it's at the warehouse then has to distribute it to other centres. Amazon's a lot easier because they have, major warehouses that then they send it out from there. But then you've got warehouses then have to send it to the booksellers themselves, so that has to go then. And there's other smaller distributors that are online, and these all can get very complex. You're sending these books; they've got to be not damaged, and I'm sure there's quite a few people who get annoyed when they receive a book and it's damaged. The thing about it is that it's a very complex business, and that all has to be run from a large publisher. You can imagine how many people that have to work on that, and all has to be paid for.
A contrast in when we did the last Sharks of the World book, trying to ship out one copy depending on where you were shipping it in the world, the shipping cost more than the actual book cost. And so here you want to get this book that I forget what it cost, but say it was $50. You might be paying $50 just to ship it. So suddenly your costs have gone up. So if you're trying to, and I never remember at that time, you just start shipping in bulk, because you could ship like 100 books for less per unit than you could for one book. And so a lot of little things that people don't think about when they think about wanting to be an illustrator or writing your own books, is that just all these other costs that are associated with, and especially if you're starting out and you haven't done a book before, to have someone, a publisher who can get the book distributed, it's a huge thing. And even now, as good as Princeton has been to us on the latest Sharks of the World book, you try to get to some countries like New Zealand or even South America that you don't have like a big distribution chain. And again, it kind of goes up the cost for those things. Those are all things to think about, for someone when you're starting out, thinking you're going to want to get your first book published. You can write a great book and you can do your own online publishing, but getting that book distributed is a challenge.
And on top of that, with the distribution, it's the sales. It's getting the book known. That's the thing. There's all these platforms out there, but it's very difficult to find out which is the best. And also there's a lot of platforms that then start charging more money and sorting it all out. And because also more and more is online, the booksellers, they are more difficult to get to. There's less and less bookshops. And especially if you look at natural history books, when I used to go up to London ages ago, and when I first started out, and you went up to Foyles, and the natural history section was a whole massive room, and it was just like absolutely amazing. It's one of those classic pictures you find of, the old bookshops with books everywhere, stacked everywhere, and there's so much information. Now when you go to Foyles, it's literally natural history is just one shelf, or part of a shelf. That's what it's shrunken down to. So you've therefore got to think about how do you get, if it's online, how do you get all that information out there? Because people don't always see the book because they're not, especially natural history, as I said, there aren't so many bookshops that have the big bookshelves or even rooms on natural history. So people can't peruse through these books, so you've got to get them out to the public, and even flick through. So you can only have about 8 spreads or something like that. So that's always a difficulty.
I was going to say, even like a lot of natural history museums, they used to carry all these types of books, and it used to be. I remember as a kid going through to different museums. It'd be nice to go look at the books. They don't even carry a lot of these books anymore, or they might carry 1 or 2, just because the margins they make on them is so minimal relative to they can put some cheesy plastic piece of crap in the store there and sell it for a lot, make a lot of profit on it, and versus the natural history books. So what would be a normal outlet to the general public was another avenue to that's kind of dried up in a lot of areas, and so trying to reach that audience. I mean, like when we do like these shark books, we know like the shark community will find out about it really quickly. It's trying to find the people that the young people and others that might be interested that you might be able to inspire. How do you reach those people, the younger people? And that's where a thing like you got to get creative or work with someone who has those skills or that distribution network.
I think a lot of it is like, especially with the field guides and things, is that it reaches a tipping point. So that basically it's trying to get the book out there, and especially with the sharks books, is that, there comes a point when there's enough people that have it in their hand that basically everybody else is starting to see that book. And I think there comes a tipping point. So often these books are slow to start off. They are very slow to start off because it's just very difficult to get that. But once it gets to that point, it gains its own momentum. So things like Sharks of the World, that because it's been around long enough, that started to gain its own momentum to sell more because people can see it in people's hands and go, oh, I'd really like that book, and then they buy it, and it just rolls on from there. But if you're first starting out, there's not so many. That's the problem. And in the old days, sometimes they used to sort of give them away, but you can't do that now. That's just too expensive to do that sort of thing. But these are very long sellers. Dave and I hopefully will be doing this until we're well into our 80s and 90s. This is our pension. This is our pension. So basically, there will be further editions. So watch this space when we do these. Because how many more species do literally? Dave can be a real pain.
We keep discovering more and more every day. It seems like.
I know. And he goes, there's another one you've got to do. There's another one you've got to do. It's like literally just go, how many more it's going to find.
Well, the thing is, there's always a delay from when you get the book actually finished, edited, laid out, published, and it comes out, and it could be 6 months or more to the actual publication date. And then of course, I always get these people said, "Hey, Dave, here's like 3 species that were not in the book. I said, well, yeah, they just got published last month, and the book, I haven't seen the book for 6 months. So it's been, so there's always that little bit of a delay. And it's because we are kind of in a renaissance right now with new species being described. And I think about 20% of all new sharks have only been described in the last 15 years. That, in the next few years, by the time the next version comes out, there'll be more new species to add into it. And I think the last one we added about 50 new species, Mark.
Yeah, it was 50. Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised the next time round it's a new edition. Yeah, I mean, I think.
Yeah.
And then you got the batoids, with the field guides. It's just going to get even more on those things. It's quite surprising how little we actually know that's out there. Even with all these guides and everything.
Yeah.
And Dave going around and looking at all these things, it's just it's exciting times, really.
Actually, we didn't even talk about our next project that Mark and I are working on right now. It's one thing, once you kind of get a couple books going with a publisher and building a relationship, it's kind of nice because it's as Mark talked about earlier, it's tough to get in the door initially, but once you kind of build a relationship and you have something going, like Mark and I have now, we've done 3 books that have been published by Princeton. We have a few more coming along, and the next one we have, which we hope will be out in the spring of 2023, is the Sharks, Rays, and Chimeras of North America, which is going to be our next book to come out. And it's going to be a 2-volume series. And we're actually working on now Volume 1, which will be the East Coast of the U.S. and the Gulf of Mexico. Will be out in the springtime. And Mark, you want to say a little bit about that? You're in the middle of the illustrations right now.
Yeah, I'll still try to put it all together.
The big sigh. He's like, yeah, right.
Exactly. It's just really interesting because basically, there's so much research still going on to this thing. Dave and I are just looking through loads of images, trying to sort it all out, the photos. Especially because things have changed. There's so much online stuff, so you can't dismiss stuff that is put up. So I go through all Facebook sites and whatever, because sometimes someone's got a photo that they don't even realise what they've got a photo of, because they've gone to a fish market or something like that. I remember in Sharks of the World, there was it the Hemipristis, the elongata, the snaggletooth, where there was this woman who was just swimming in the Mediterranean, and she just snapped this shark, and she didn't realise what she had. It was, first really good picture of a snaggletooth shark actually live swimming around. And that's the thing. It's just, you have to keep on looking. My wife Julie, she's really good at that. She does a lot of picture research, and you just pour through all these things to try and get it updated, because a lot of this, the rarer things are from papers and research papers, and they're often described from dead specimens, and therefore you've got to sort of have in your mind's eye about, when you're looking through all these images, could that possibly be that species? So then I send it on to Dave and going, Dave, is this actually a live footage of this species? And he checks it all out, and he does all the taxonomical things to make sure.
That's the interesting thing that I'm trying to figure out. Like, a lot of these species are new species. And so you must have to really start looking through photos and maybe even pictures of live specimens or sort of preserved specimens. Have you ever come across any where you had to assume some of the body parts or anything? Because it must be difficult in some cases. There may not be any pictures, or the pictures is of from Dave and the sample that he has, but it may not be great, or even from a Facebook photo. Are there some where you have to make assumptions on what their body's going to look like, or is that against the are there a certain set of rules that you have to follow?
You have to create. When I first did Sharks of the World, there were loads that were just literally from descriptions. All those Apisteuris cat sharks that were done at that time were basically based on 1 or 2 specimens that I actually saw photos of them live, and then just tried to work out mind's eye exactly what the distortion was from the preserved specimen, and then apply the same sort of factual stuff and other people's rough drawings and work out what it could possibly be. But the best one, Dave, was the one with the big eye sand tiger, where we were working on this one illustration, and I couldn't resolve why there were why the photos just didn't agree that I had. And I was just looking at the thing going, which one do you want me to draw? And he goes, what do you mean, which one do I want you to draw? And you could take it up, because I don't know all the facts about what happened then.
Yeah. This has happened a few times. We think we uncovered a new species of big-eyed sand tiger from Mark. Mark started sharing me all these different illustrations he had. And coincidentally, Will White, who was on the show, and Gavin Naylor and I had been talking separately about, we think there might be a second species here. And as it turned out, if you look at the illustration or look at the photographs we have from different parts of the world, there may be a second species. And that's happened a few times where Mark's flagged something that didn't look quite right. And I started looking at it and I go like, well, that looks like it's probably a new species. And so then I got to go track down where the specimen is, if there is a specimen, because sometimes they just take pictures and then they discard the specimen. And then, because of course, not knowing that it might be something new or different. Those are always fun ones to do. When you have something, you're going like, oh, Molly, we might have something new here. And so, as I say, that's happened a few times. The big-eyed sand tiger was a classic, though. It was just like, I think we've got another species here, but that's a shark that gets 4 meters long. So good luck trying to get one that somebody can, stick in their lunchbox and bring home or bring to a museum. It's hard enough getting a meter and a half shark anywhere, let alone something that's 4 meters. So those are kind of fun things, though. I have to say they're kind of fun moments where like, wow, here's something kind of cool we didn't know about. And a lot of that came from Mark's having the illustrator eye to look at something and go like, hey, this is something that's really different. Or there's some differences here. If I could just add on to the thing about, you asked the question, Andrew, about like some of these illustrations. Some of these things are only known from 1 or 2 specimens that were collected over 100 years ago. And so if you're fortunate and they did a nice illustration at the time, you could probably work something out from that. And sometimes they'll give some color stuff, but a lot of times they're just brown or gray or black. And that's more the preserved color. And you don't have a lot to work off of from that. And you just have to kind of go with, we try to usually mention like, well, it's preserved, here's kind of what it looks like. We don't really know what it is. And so you just hope that it doesn't come out that it turns out to be some kind of brilliant color. It's not even related to what you're looking at after preservation, but they definitely look much more beautiful in life than they do after they've been preserved. That's for sure.
I think that's the biggest thing is to try and create the illustrations of a live specimen, if you possibly can. But it's difficult, and also my illustrations I always update every so often because suddenly a better photo comes out, and I'm always onto it because I want to get this thing as accurate as possible, because you're basing it on very bad photos, descriptions. If suddenly a species comes along, like the Leucomelatus that you showed a photo of, I hadn't seen it, but you were doing that thing in South Africa or somewhere like that.
Oh yeah.
And you suddenly showed this photo and oh god, I've got to do this again, because it was just that he just had, it was a fresh specimen and I hadn't seen a fresh specimen. And I think these things are just ongoing all the time.
That was a white-tipped weasel shark that I've found when I did a TV show with Forrest Galani in 2020. And nobody had really seen one for like 35 years until we came across the ones there. All of a sudden we found a couple of them. And so we sent them to you like, hey, here's some fresh pictures of one, which looked totally different than the preserved one. Much better, by the way. But so there's always something new to kind of put together from these different species. And each time we do a book, we're always trying to improve on them.
Yeah, I think what is interesting is that when I first started out doing Sharks of the World is that a lot of the line work that was done was from preserved specimens, and a lot of the species were sort of seemed very distinct. They'll be easy to tell apart. But when you start to look at the fresh specimens, they all get very similar. And I think I can understand how they get confused, because they do look far more similar when they're live or fresh. But when they get distorted, they distort in their own funny way, and it just accentuates certain features. And they do look, more different than they probably do actually in life. And therefore, you can get a false sense of security about IDing a lot of these species from the old illustrations.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I just have, as we sort of kind of come to an end of this interview, which has been fantastic, really enlightening. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you. They're kind of fun questions about sort of your history in illustration. So one of those questions, what's your most favorite species to draw? Doesn't have to be sharks, but what's your most? It would be better if it was sharks, but truthfully, what is your most favorite species to draw?
It depends. It depends really. I like complexity, so anything that tends to, have these amazing patinations. I've just done this, all the angel sharks, working with Kat Gordon at the Shark Trust. And we've just done all the angel sharks, and it's understanding those patinations, because they're just not just simply, they've just got loads of freckles all over and then a few other bits and pieces. And you can start to see that the patterns are very similar. It's just that they've just been arranged just slightly. So I think things that are heavily patterned, so something like the angel sharks at present moment, because I've just finished them, to do with that, because it's just a lot more interesting. But they're all fascinating. I mean, literally every single time I work on another species, it's just, wow, these are just amazing things. Things like the Epmopterus, the lantern sharks, where these big, huge eyes, and they're just, I know they're tiny, but just like it just, they're so specialized that, they're just beyond, your normal fish that you normally do. They're just like so evolved in their own way. And they just, you can understand why people really get hooked on sharks when you start working on that, that they are just amazing things.
Absolutely. Now here's a question, deep sea sharks or more shallow sharks? Which one do you prefer to draw?
Deep sea. Well, the deep sea,
because of the complexity, I assume.
Well, having said angel sharks are sort of partly deep sea, they're sort of straddled, but I think deep sea sharks, right, because they tend to get a little bit more wacky. I mean, especially when you see the footage of the deep sea sharks, and I will count also chimeras in that. They are just literally, they are out this world, aren't they? They're just out this world. They just literally are. Just some person's just. It comes out of one of those dreams that people had, just literally, I've just had this really wacky idea, I'm going to have this animal that's just got this whippy tail and these huge eyes and these weird, horn teeth and like one gill, and just, you couldn't imagine it, literally. That's hence their name Chimera. It's just like stuck all loads of bits on all together. And
I got one last question for you, Mark, and that's, we always ask all our guests, is like, sort of, what advice would you have for someone young starting out in a career that might be interested in pursuing an illustration career, or maybe doing designs and books and stuff? What advice would you have for them?
Always have a pen and paper, or pencil and paper, and just carry on drawing, because that's how you explore your art. You look at all those guys that just do amazing stuff. It's just carry on drawing. And that's why I say to even those people who think they haven't got a talent, even though you, Andrew, get a pen and paper, just doodle, just draw, it helps your mind. It really is therapeutic. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be to accurate standards or anything, because you'll develop your own style, and it doesn't always have to be done like that. There are other scientific illustrators that use a different type of genre of work to do that, but just carry on drawing. Just, even if you can't draw, you'll always get better. You'll always find a little trick every single day. You do something. So for those people starting out, and it doesn't have to be expensive. It just be an ordinary pencil, just doodle anywhere on everything.
I have to admit, my daughter does that. She draws a lot and all the time. It's her way of coping with, if anything's stressful in her life or even fun in her life, she's always drawing something. So I definitely see that, and she's always getting better and better as she goes along.
Exactly, and encourage every single second she does that, because basically she's exploring that, and she's exploring herself and exploring what she can actually do. It's the thing we'd always done. You look at these cave paintings that were done. Just that's what we did. That was the most amazing things. And look at the talent that was there. We just have the ability to do that, and it's a real positive ability. And don't ever get scared that your work isn't good enough, because that's not true. You even if you have fun, and it's cheap fun. It's not dangerous fun or anything else like that. It's just have fun.
That's great, Mark. It's really been a pleasure having you on today for the show and kind of hearing about your journey, about working on what it's actually like to work on some of these different projects, illustration and books and everything. It's been a real treat having you on here. Hopefully, people come away, some budding illustrators and authors, and have a little sense of what it's like to embark on doing your first book or your third.
Yeah, exactly. we can't be here forever. Somebody's got to replace us. So definitely there it is. I think, and thank you for inviting me on. I had a really pleasurable time. Thank you.
Oh, it was our pleasure. Thank you so much for being on.